Very much, Professor, and I'd like to express my great gratitude to Professor Inas for inviting me to this very important meeting. As you have said that I'm going to talk about the challenges
دكتور
of
ناصر
hypertension.
قرب الميكروفون من بقك شويه وزعق فينا.
I'm going to talk about the challenges of hypertension and diabetes. As I'm a cardiologist, you might be expecting that I will show you a lot of catheters and interventions. Actually, I'm not going to do this. This is the expectation of the International Diabetes Federation, and as you see, Egypt ranks the 10th in the world in the prevalence of diabetes, and we have 11 million persons diabetic. This is going to be doubled over the next 20 years, and we are going to be in the 9th rank in the world by the year 2045. The major challenge in diabetes is that a lot of the diabetic patients are not actually diagnosed, and we have in Egypt about 62% of the diabetics are not diagnosed. This makes us in the highest prevalence of undiagnosed diabetics, not only in the region, but also in the world. As regards hypertension, we have the same problem. Hypertension in the 100 Million Taha, which is a project that surveyed nearly 60 million persons in Egypt a few years ago, and we got, these patients were surveyed, these people were surveyed for hypertension, diabetes, as well as for hepatitis C, aiming at eradication of hepatitis C from Egypt. And I believe that this task had been fulfilled. But the most important that we got a survey of hypertension prevalence, and it was nearly 20%, but this mounts up to 27% in Cairo, and in Port Said it reached 30%. These figures are very similar to those provided by Professor Mohsen Ibrahim in 1995, where the Egyptian hypertension project had been done. And this showed that we have 26% of the patients, of the people in Egypt above the age of 20 having hypertension. But the most striking thing that we have only 8% of the hypertensive patients controlled. Only 8%. And this is our first and major challenge. We have a challenge of undiagnosed diabetic patients, 62%, and we have a challenge of uncontrolled hypertension patients. Only 8% are being effectively treated. Actually, hypertension and diabetes share common risk factors, including the genetics, the insulin resistance, the dyslipidemia, and obesity. All this contribute to the pathophysiology of both diabetes and hypertension. Both diseases, diabetes and hypertension, will lead to atherosclerosis, endothelial dysfunction, vascular inflammation, vascular fibrosis, and arterial remodeling. And this will lead to the micro and the macrovascular complications that will lead finally to cardiovascular diseases. Both diabetes and hypertension has underlying pathophysiologic mechanisms through which macro and the microvascular diseases are being are occurring. And this includes the hyperglycemia, the RAS activation, the immune system activation, the oxidative stresses, and the inflammation, as well as the involving of microRNA. Type 2 diabetes patients have a lot of complications. Diabetic patients are likely to have microvascular complications in 50% of the patients during the next 10 years. This includes the kidney, the nerves, and the eyes. 45% of the diabetic patients will develop myocardial infarction. Diabetic patients are 45% more likely to develop myocardial infarction versus non-diabetic patients. They are also more prone to stroke. Their risk is increased by 72% versus the non-diabetics, and hospitalization for heart failure is also increased by 33% in diabetics versus non-diabetics. And this culminates into the most deleterious complications of either diabetes or hypertension. 2/3 of the diabetic patients actually die from cardiovascular diseases. The interaction between the diabetes or the metabolic status, the heart and the kidney is very paramount. The metabolic status includes the hyperglycemia, the dyslipidemia, the insulin resistance, and the altered hormonal milieu, and the adipokines. This will cause cardiac dysfunction as well as renal dysfunction. On the other way around, the cardiac dysfunction, including the neurohormonal activation, the hypoperfusion, the volume overload, and the arterial resistance, and the change in the substrates utilization and autonomic dysfunction will cause both metabolic disorder and hypertension and renal affection. The renal diseases also affect the cardiac function and the metabolic status. And this is our second challenge. We are no more able to treat the patients, or we are not able to treat diabetes alone. We are not able to treat the heart alone. And we are not actually able to treat the kidney alone. We should have training in all the three aspects. And this mandates the development of a cardio-renal metabolic specialist. And this should be included in the training of the postgraduates. And this is our next challenge. We have to develop a new specialty, which is the cardio-renal and metabolic specialist. Actually, treating diabetes or diabetic patients should include the tight glucose control to less hemoglobin A1C less than 7, should include blood pressure control tightly to less than 130/80 in most of the patients. Some patients we might be a little bit redundant to 140/90 if the risk is very low, but most of the patients we should reduce the blood pressure to less than 130/80. The LDL level should be below 70 in most of the patients. If the patients are high risk, and moderate patients we should go to less than 100, but in extremely high risk patients we might go below 55, and even we might need to reduce the LDL below 40. And we can utilize a lot of drugs for this, including statins, ezetimibe, PCSK9 inhibitors, and also inclisiran. Lifestyle modification with weight loss and smoking cessation is very important. 10 millimeter reduction of the blood pressure is associated with reduction in mortality, reduction in cardiovascular death, reduction in coronary heart disease death, reduction in heart failure, improvement of the renal outcome, and reduction of the incidence of retinopathy and albuminuria. So reduction of blood pressure is of paramount importance. Actually, unfortunately, not all the cardiometabolic risk factors could be improved. Hyperglycemia could be treated, obesity could be overcome, dyslipidemia could be treated, hypertension, inflammation, smoking could be stopped, and sedentary life could be improved. But we cannot change the age, unfortunately, and fortunately, we cannot change the gender. However, the genetics is being classified as non-modifiable risk factors till now. But I think in the future, this might be treated. The multifactorial control of risk factors in type 2 diabetes resulted in a major reduction in the event rate in death and the myocardial infarction and stroke in the treated patients. This was achieved by a reduction of the stroke, the systolic blood pressure, the diastolic blood pressure, the LDL, the A1C, and the combined effect on these factors together could reduce the problem or the event rates. But we couldn't decrease the body mass index. Obesity could not be improved, and the smoking could not be decreased. So the risk factors is the most important thing to tackle. If we fail to do this, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is going to occur, and if we fail to combat this, heart failure and eventually death will take place. Fortunately enough, we could find drugs in both categories of hypertension and diabetes that affected the other category. And as you see here, most of our used drugs in hypertension, including ARBs, ACE inhibitors, and calcium channel blocker, prevent the development of diabetes. And this occurs through a very complex mechanism, but it involves the angiotensin 1-4 production that is produced mainly from angiotensin 1 by the NAP enzyme, and this will cause the insulin-regulated aminopeptidases will change, and this finally will improve the insulin resistance and might prevent the future of diabetes. This is the ACE inhibitors, and this one the angiotensin blocker, and they share the same mechanism for prevention of diabetes and atherosclerosis regression. On the other way around, a diabetic drug has been very useful, has been shown to be very useful in prevention of the cardiovascular disease, and the empagliflozin and all the gliflozins have shown a major reduction in the A1C, and they could also improve the stroke, cardiovascular disease, and death, myocardial infarction and stroke, could reduce significantly death from cardiovascular disease, could reduce the death from any cause, and could reduce the hospitalization for heart failure. And but this is the next challenge. We could reduce significantly the all-cause death by empagliflozin in the EMPERIC trial, but the residual death is still there. And this is our third challenge, ladies and gentlemen. And this was my last slide.
Thank you very much. شكرين. دكتور ناصر اتفضل استريح.